Welcome to episode 3 of the Board Game Workshop. I'm your host, Chris Anderson. Today we have an interview with Chip Beauvais, and we'll get to that right after the news. So, first things first, Granite Games Summit is coming up in April. I will be there. Chip will also be there. He will have several prototypes and chroma cubes and universal rule. If you want to find him, his contact info will be at the end of the interview. I will be there with some prototypes and always looking for a game. Granite Games Summit is April 7th through April 9th in Nashua, New Hampshire. So if you're in the Northeast, it looks to be a lot of fun. You can get more information for that at granitegamesummit.com. Submissions for the Boston Festival of Indie Games open today, March 15th, and everything is due April 15th. The Boston Festival of Indie Games is a tabletop and digital game showcase. They give out awards for Best of Show. It's a great place to show off new designs to a lot of people. And you can check out bostonfig.com to find out more about that. On to contests. The Game Crafter currently has 2 contests open. Their Big Box Challenge is due June 5th, and the Gamehole Dungeon Crawler Challenge is due August 14th. Both of those look to be interesting contests. You can check those out at thegamecrafter.com/contests. Button Shy Games is doing their wallet game contest. It's due April 23rd, and it's a very restrictive design. You can only use 18 cards and 10 coins. So you can check that out at buttonshygames.com. And in other Button Shy news, my game published with them, in Vino Morte, is going to be re-released in July on Kickstarter. So you can check that out on Board Game Geek. And that does it for the news. If you are a game designer and you would like to come on the show and talk about a game you're working on or just design theory in general, you can email me at theboardgameworkshop@gmail.com and let me know what you'd like to talk about. All right, now on to the interview. Okay, we are here today with Chip Beauvais, designer of Chroma Cubes, Smoke and Mirrors, Universal Rule, and the Twitter game A Little Alliteration, which I was doing perfect at for a while. Chip, welcome to the show.
Hi, Chris. It's good. Glad to be here. This is great.
Cool. So, let's start with how'd you get into board games and what got you to start designing?
So, like a lot of people, I really got into designer board games through Magic. My wife and I were trying to learn how to play a Star Wars CCG by Decipher. And we kind of came to the idea that learning another collectible card game would help us along that path. So one day we joined a group at college that was teaching people how to play Magic, and that kind of consumed the rest of our lives for a good number of years, and that led into other board games, other at the time sort of German games, because most of them that we found out about were from Germany, and we joined a local gaming group. And, and things kind of evolved from there. And I think in 2010, Protospiel had a card game design contest. And so that was sort of my first foray into designing a game for a competition. And my game was selected as one of the finalists. It didn't actually win, but moreover, the experience and the people that I met going to Protospiel really sort of drew me into the hobby. So that's sort of the short version of how I got into game design.
Cool. I have been playing Magic most of my life at this point, actually, but it's a good start.
Yeah, Magic is a great thing. I highly recommend it for any designer.
Oh, definitely.
I haven't been playing as much for the last couple of years, but I've still been keeping tabs on like new mechanics when they come out and new things that they're adding to the game. So it's very interesting.
Yeah, a lot of their design articles too were much wider reaching than just Magic.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mark Rosewater has some amazing stuff.
Yeah, and he's probably one of the people that I quote the most because he has so many good things to say. I mean, even simple things like restrictions breed creativity.
Yep.
That's a wonderful thing. And he has this series on 10 basic rules that every game must follow. Every game design must have these 10 things. Um, and also, he started, I believe it was him. He started the concept of player um, profiles for different
Yep.
people for how they play Magic. And I actually sort of took a riff off of that and expanded it um, to create 6 different player psychographic profiles for different people and why they play games. Um, and to me, I found that useful as a design tool.
Yeah. Cool. So you wanted to talk about probabilities today. Do you want to
Yes,
do an intro to why we're talking about these probabilities?
sure. So this is a game design that I'm working on, and it's very sort of early stage. So a lot of things are probably going to change. Um, but one of the things I found interesting in it is the creating a system where where a player is going to attempt to do something, or their character is going to attempt to do something, and we have to decide whether or not it's successful, and use a die roll for that effect. And
Mm-hmm.
what I'm looking for is something that's very simple, uses existing components, and yet has the correct level of granularity. So, for example, if you have a D20, then you could say, you need to roll a 16 or less. Um, or you could do this other thing where you need to roll a 17 or less. Then the second action has a 5% greater probability of being successful. So basically, with a 20-sided die, you have increments of about 5%. But if you're using a regular 6-sided die, then your then your increments of probability are a lot more chunky. So
Yeah.
if you say roll a 1 or less, or a 2 or less, and so on, then those probabilities are 16%, 33%, 50%, and then 67%, and then 83, I think,
It sounds close.
and then obviously 100%. So if you want to give the player more control, or if you want to have more nuance than that, 1 out of 6 probability, then one of the things that you can do, and sticking with the restriction of limiting your component to each player just having one die, um, is that you can then have sequential die rolls where the result of the probability isn't determined by a single roll, but it may be dependent on 2 rolls. So, for example, you could say, if you wanted something that was less likely than just rolling 1 out of 6, you could say roll a 1 out of 6 and then also roll a 3 or less, and that gives you 50% of that 16, the original 16%, which gives you about 8%.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so now you get closer to having small increments of probability that you can play around with, so that you can more accurately represent the difficulty of a particular thing the character is trying to do. So one of the things I found in this that's interesting is that there are certain um, there are certain combinations of things that even if you um, or unless you actually sit down and do the math, you wouldn't realize that um, they have the same probability. So just to choose an example from my spreadsheet, um, the chance of rolling a one or a two on a single die roll, or the chance of rolling three or less followed by another roll that's four or less. So if you had to choose between those two things, they don't on the outset sound like they would have the same probability, but it turns out that they do. So this gets into something that I think is interesting is that the the actual mathematical probabilities are one aspect of a design, but what's more important is how players, assuming that they're not mathematicians that sit down and actually figure these things out, how players react to certain probabilities and how they feel about different probabilities. So it's almost less important which of the two options is more or less probable, um, but it's more interesting to think about how that affects a player emotionally and how they're going to feel about it.
That's interesting because then you can keep the actual probabilities the same, but if you design it in a certain way, you can make it more or less stressful to the player, make it more exciting.
Exactly. So something like the example that I just uh, that I just threw out there, rolling a two or one, that's a single die roll. So you roll it and then that's it. You know what the answer, what the outcome is immediately.
Mm-hmm.
The roll three and roll four has a few different stages in it because you could either fail the first roll and that feels a certain way, or you could pass the first roll and then fail the second one, and that becomes more exciting.
Yeah.
The other thing is that the order in which the rolls happen does not affect the mathematical probability. So I described it as roll a three or less, and then follow that up by rolling a four or less, which is actually more probable than the first roll. So if I were to actually have that as part of the game, I would reverse the two of them. In other words, I want the easier roll to happen first, because then the tension increases as you make each subsequent die roll, as opposed to having all the tension in the first die roll and then have the second one be something that feels like a sure thing.
It's interesting. So for all your stuff here, are you only looking at two die rolls, not three?
Yeah, now see that's a good question because I think the what I'm looking for is the simplest thing that will work.
Yeah.
So I don't necessarily want to. I could certainly extend this to add a third die roll, and that would give us additional granularity. But the question is, how much, um, how important is it to sort of get that extra precision? Um, so within using two die rolls, two subsequent die rolls, and um, the other thing is that these are combinations of die rolls, so it's not just do this roll and then do that one successfully. It's also do this one, and if you fail, you get a second chance for success with the second die roll. Um, so altogether, there's like 30, 35 different combinations, um, and there's some overlap in the individual probabilities that arise from that. But
Mm-hmm.
even within here, if um, there's one sort of gap between about 59% and 66%. So that's a 7% difference of in probabilities that, if I wanted to create an event that had a probability between those two, I wouldn't be able to do it with just two die rolls, or without adding some other twist to how the action is resolved. But then the question is, and I think this is an interesting question, is what's the smallest increment in probability that a player can be aware of and will have sort of an emotional reaction to? So, for example, if you'd say this is 5% likely or this is 6% likely, um, depending, as long as the outcome wasn't too severely different between the two, I wouldn't necessarily really care. So,
Yeah.
if you said, well, would you rather have a 5% chance of getting $100, or would you rather have a 6% chance of getting $99.62? I'm kind of like, well, I don't, that's too small an increment for me to really have a strong gut feeling for.
Yeah.
So, whereas if you said like there's a 25% difference in the probability of a particular outcome, now you've got my attention. That's something that I feel is significant.
Yeah. I wonder if they've done psychological studies on this. I'm sure they have because they've studied pretty much everything.
Yeah, there's not anything that I'm aware of, but of course that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. Um, because humans are humans are generally bad at probability as opposed to other forms of mathematics. So,
Yeah.
for example, you know, you might not understand, you might not be very familiar with all the rules of physics and calculus and like what parabolas look like. But if I throw a ball to you, you have a pretty good chance of catching it. You have an intuition of of what shape the arc is going to take. Um, but probability doesn't. People don't have a good intuition for probability. And I think part of that is that you only ever really experience the outcome. So if something is 80% likely but it doesn't happen, um, that doesn't feel right to us somehow.
Yeah.
I mean, another good example is the Monte Carlo, or not that, the Monty Hall problem, and that's something that um, you can twist people into, um, you can sort of easily push people down the wrong path of thinking by saying, well, one of the doors has been opened, there are two doors left, so therefore it's a 1 in 2 chance. Anytime you say, okay, there are three outcomes and one of them is the one that we want, then there must be a 1/3 chance of that happening, is overlooking the um, is overlooking the requirement that all three things had to be equally likely to begin with.
Yeah. That's always an interesting one. And people just don't get it,
Yeah, yeah,
which is where game design can come in and do all sorts of fun things.
yeah, and it's interesting. So another game that I worked on is called Smoke and Mirrors, and this is a bluffing game where you have three cards and they have numbers on them, and you're called upon to create a particular number by adding one or more of your cards together, and there are different probabilities based on all the possible distributions of cards that will tell you things like if you're called upon to create the sum of three, it's it's relatively unlikely that you'll be able to do that. However, the important thing is that this is a bluffing game. So, regardless of what the probabilities are, players start and player groups start to sort of create their own rules as they become familiar with the game, or create their own heuristics, I should say, that say whether a particular player is likely to have the number that the combination of cards that they claim to. And something really interesting happens in a bluffing game where if you can make a claim that on the face of it seems impossible, but the player who has to call your bluff, if they stop for a minute and figure out a way in which, even if it's unlikely, if they figure out a way in which it is possible, then they're more likely to believe you because they've taken the time to sort of convince themselves that it could happen. And that makes it, in their mind, more likely. So it kind of creates this counterintuitive result where if you're going to bluff, don't bluff with something that's likely. Bluff with something that makes the player initially think it's impossible and then convince themselves that it's possible, and then they'll be too scared to call your bluff.
Good advice. Good advice. I do enjoy Smoke and Mirrors. It's a lot of fun for such a simple game.
Oh, thank you.
But we are running out of time, so is there anything you would like to plug? I know, is Chroma Cubes coming out soon? What's the...
Yes, so Chroma Cubes, this is actually another... Chroma Cubes is interesting in the concept of this discussion because each die has a different distribution of symbols on it, where the symbols are either common, so they appear on half the faces, or uncommon, where they only appear on one face. So in Chroma Cubes, I'm dealing with probabilities of either 1/2 or 1/6 per die. But you have 6 different dice. They all have different distributions of symbols, and I use going back to players' intuitions, I use the color wheel as a way of giving players an intuitive grasp of what the probabilities of rolling different colors with different dice. So all of that is to say, yes, Chroma Cubes is going to be coming to Kickstarter this year. It's been picked up by Grail Games, based out in Australia.
I just backed their last one for Majiti, the card game.
Yes, I was going to say they've been doing a lot of interesting things with both reprints and new games from Reiner Knizia. They also did Catbox. Last year they did Too Many Cinderellas before then, and a host of other games. So I'm very excited to be working with them.
Cool. Do you have a month for that yet, or?
I do not. I'm thinking maybe summer, but it's still a little early at this point.
Cool. Well, let me know when you find out, and I'll definitely put it in the news.
I certainly will. And the easiest way for people to reach me is by Twitter. I'm at @the_flying sheep. That's the @ symbol, THE, the underscore symbol, FLYINGSHEEP.
Well, thank you very much for coming on, and we will hopefully have you back again.
Great. Well, I'm always happy to talk about game design, and I look forward to coming back and going on about some other topic. So thank you for the opportunity.
That does it for this episode. Thanks for listening. If you'd like to get in touch with the show, you can email theboardgameworkshop@gmail.com. You can check out the website, theboardgameworkshop.com. You can find it on Twitter, the BG Workshop. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, I'm at BlueCubeBGS. And I will talk to you soon.